Okay.
Well, I'm very happy to welcome Professor Stephen Hanke, a renowned and eminent expert on economy and currency markets, and Gülem Atabay, who's a well-known economist in Turkey who's worked at various banks. Welcome to AFAL TV.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
Professor Hanke, I'd like to, maybe we can start with something that's been quite controversial in Turkey and elsewhere among analysts around the world, is your calculation of Turkish inflation. What is your response to those criticisms? Because a lot of people believe that they're a little bit off.
Well, I don't know exactly which criticisms you're talking about, but generally, those that are doing the talking and criticizing, they just don't know the professional literature. They're basically ignorant, to put it bluntly. They don't know what the scholarly literature is in this field. And the scholarly literature shows unambiguously at high rates of inflation. Once the inflation rate goes over about 35%, you can use what's called purchasing power parity theory to transform changes in exchange rates into implied inflation rates. And so this is a very orthodox, very standard. There are many articles and books that have been written on it. One of the most famous ones was actually by Jacob Frankel in 1976 in the Swedish Journal of Economics. And Frankel worked the whole thing out, and I'm basically following that same idea. Now, purchasing power parity, of course, has been around for a long time. The name actually came at the first part of the 20th century. Cassel, a Swedish economist, was the first one to actually call purchasing power parity by that name. And usually what purchasing power parity is used for is they look at differentials in inflation rates and try to forecast the course of exchange rates. But the trick is I've just reversed the thing. I know what the changes in the exchange rates are, and you can go from that using purchasing power parity to transform it into the implied inflation rates. And as I say, if the inflation's above 35%, this is very accurate, and as it goes higher and higher, the inflation rate, it becomes perfectly accurate. I mean, the correlations are over 99%. So I would just say to those critics, they really don't know what they're talking about. They've never studied the literature. They don't understand it. Right now, the inflation rate in Turkey today is 101% per annum on an annual basis. And that's a very accurate estimate. The one other confusion about this is that most price indices that are used to measure inflation are a very tiny little narrow basket of consumer goods. The basket, if you use purchasing power parity, you have an aggregate basket. Everything is included. Goods, services, asset prices, everything is included. There's nothing that's excluded. So there are two confusions. One, they simply don't know the literature and don't understand what's going on. But there is a difference in the sense that when I say inflation is 101% today, that's on a basket of everything in Turkey, not just the narrow basket that's used by the Turkish authorities, which I can't remember right now off the top of my head the rate. I think it's about 16% or something like that, the last official rate. It's just way off. And that's why all of the economic policy in Turkey on the exchange rate is just off, because the only way you can stop the carry trade from unwinding and stabilize the lira, you'd have to have interest rates now up towards 100%, you see. You have to have real interest rates that are positive to stop a currency collapse. And of course, as we saw last night, the lira collapsed again. And I said this. I did an interview back in May, and I said the lira was headed towards 7 to the dollar, and that's more or less where it is now.
Right. So you're saying basically the inflation in Turkey is unreliable. I mean, are the calculations in Turkey any different to other countries? Are you saying that most countries' inflation calculations are unreliable, or is Turkey a special?
No, Turkey is not a special case. That most countries calculate inflation the same way Turkey is doing, and this is pretty reliable if you have inflation that actually is low. If you have low inflation rates, this is pretty. It's a reasonable way to do it. You take a sample every month. You get the whatever is in the index in the basket. You measure the change in the price from month to month, and things are going slowly, and it's pretty accurate. But when inflation becomes very high, it completely disintegrates these baskets that are normally used, and they're very inaccurate.
Why not just go to the IMF, make a program, or further membership talks to the European Union? I mean, Turkey has no anchor at all at the moment. Wouldn't that help in part?
Well, no, the IMF is an utter disaster. They have one failure after another. They're failing big time in Argentina right now. The peso just collapsed last night, and that's one reason the lira collapsed even further. The IMF really doesn't know what it's doing, and they have a very disastrous record. I was delighted when Erdogan finally refused to renew the IMF agreement a few years ago and got rid of the IMF. So forget the IMF. The European Union is something else, and the euro is something else, and Turkey's not going to get into the EU anytime soon. So this is no solution for the problem we're talking about right now. Now, one thing you could do, if it was politically acceptable, is have a euro-based currency board. You could join the eurozone informally, like Bulgaria is. Bulgaria is not a member of the eurozone formally, but they have a unified currency with the eurozone, with the lev and the currency board. So you could easily do that in Turkey, and if the authorities would go along with it, it would be fine. I have no problem with having a euro-based currency board. The only reason I suggested gold is because you've got sanctions against Turkey right now. You've got sanctions against Russia. You've got sanctions against Iran. And I suggested that all three of those countries should have a gold-backed currency board system, keep their local currencies, make them as good as gold, and essentially form a big gold bloc.
Isn't that risking more political instability, both regionally and within those countries? Because obviously that wouldn't go down well with the United States and the international.
What would the United States have to say about it? The United States doesn't issue gold; it issues dollars. So you're gonna. It's just a hypothetical you're raising that's silly, I think. The sanctions are unpredictable because the United States has gone sanction mad. I'm totally against sanctions of any kind because they're exactly the same as tariffs. Sanctions interfere with voluntary exchange and free markets and are a complete disaster. There's a lot of scholarly literature on sanctions, starting even with the Napoleonic Wars and the blockade, the continental system. It didn't work. No sanctions work. They're always unworkable. They never achieve their objective. I'm against sanctions, but we have a government in the United States that is issuing lots of sanctions every day, new sanctions.
Yeah, just Just, I wanted to ask you, Mr. Hanke. I mean, Professor Hanke. I mean, you've given guidance about how you think the government should act in terms of its currency, but how do you think it should act now in terms of its economy? Because the situation is critical. Let's assume that there's not going to be a currency board for the time being. What would you suggest that the government does right now?
Well, if they're not going to stabilize the lira, the game is over. The game is over, because stability might not be everything, but everything is nothing without stability. So you can't formulate intelligently any kind of economic policies or reforms if everything is unstable. If you're in the middle of a currency crisis, you have to stop the crisis. That's the first thing. And then you can decide what to do. There are many reforms that have to be done in Turkey. And unfortunately, although the initial Erdogan government started out right, and I think did a number of reforms that I thought were excellent, they still have a long way to go. They have this huge informal economy taking up 40% of the economy or something like that. It's very inefficient. And they really have to, in short, enter a supply side program. And so the supply side program is like a stool with three legs. The first thing is that the tax system would have to be simplified and taxes lowered. The second thing, which of course in Turkey is huge, is deregulating the economy and deregulating the labor market in particular. That's huge. Everything in Turkey is in the formal economy is wrapped up in a huge ball of red tape and backsheesh and corruption. It's a complete drag on the economy and the supply side of the economy. And the third thing, the third leg on the stool of supply side economics would be some big privatizations. You have to get into a big privatization program and basically shrink the balance sheet of the government. So that's what I would do. But the problem is you can't do it because Erdogan has no credibility right now. He's got nationalist fervor and a base surrounding him, all excited and everything. But in reality, when it comes to economics, Erdogan's credibility is zero. So the only way he can regain credibility is to stop the currency crisis and stop inflation. And the only way he can do that is with a currency board. That's the only way.
So bringing in new people won't work. Bringing in, say, Babajan from the past. You know, he was a very well thought of economy minister, or figures like that. You don't think that's enough?
Too late. Too late. All these figures, they have no new ideas. You've got to do something big and something that works. Babajan would come in, he'd get the IMF, he'd start negotiating with the IMF, and all these guys want to do is pass the begging bowl and get foreign aid and foreign bailouts. That's their only idea they have. They don't have any other ideas. In a crisis, they have one idea: pass the begging bowl and get the IMF or somebody else to bail them out.